Hey guys, it's me, Ms. Denney, just wanting to give you a different way of getting the information this week. Instead of just reading, I'm going to give you a little presentation. This is just part 1, so expect part 2 and maybe even part 3 in the next couple of days. All I want you to do right now is take notes and answer the exit ticket at the end. I'm trusting you to do the notes. All I need to see is the exit ticket turned in at the end of this presentation. The first key concept we're going to briefly cover is how the United States continued to industrialize during the early 20th century. In the 1920s, especially, cities grew and employment opportunities rose in major cities in the US. However, this was all leading up to a big financial collapse known as the Great Depression. So the first person we're going to look at is Henry Ford. Henry Ford, have you heard that before? Ford cars? Yeah, it's a type of car, and he was the first person to create the automobile. And he's also known for creating a system of manufacturing called the assembly line, which basically means people work on each part of the product and put it all in one line to make it a little bit of a preview of what an assembly line is. Basically, a part or different parts of the car are made one by one and put together in a really step-by-step line so that more can be mass-produced. You'll see in the next slide what that looks like. So here you can see the Model T Ford. You see the first car is the finished product. The next part is going to get the roof put on top. And these are all going to be get their roofs one by one put on top so that a bunch can be made at one time. I'm sure the factory assembled each part in the specific lineup and so that they can make a bunch. In response to the mass industry that was happening for the first time ever, as you can imagine, there were all sorts of problems that arose that people had not dealt with before, and progressives were groups of people who created movements to address the corruption or injustices that they saw within industrialization. So we're going to look at a few examples of that on the next coming slide. So pragmatism is a political philosophy that would become popular in the late 1800s, and progressives would adopt in their approach to change. It basically says that the idea of good is not fixed, that it is changeable, and that we should approach our morals in an active way. The founder of this idea is named William James. He lectured on this philosophy, and progressives like John Dewey applied it to things like education. And here's John Dewey, one of the people who adopted the pragmatic approach to change. He saw the education system as too stagnant, as in not moving. He thought the way of educating kids through textbooks instead of experiences was not wrong. So he kind of revolutionized education to the collaborative way that we educate now today. Another key movement during the progressive era was prohibition, which was, if you think prohibit means to forbid, prohibit the use of alcohol. So a lot of people in the United States saw a big problem with alcohol abuse, and people were drinking 3 times more than they were today in the 1800s, and people attributed the alcohol abuse to the corruption of society. At first, the fight against alcohol use was led by women, mostly in the temperance movement, in the women's Christian temperance movement. This had a more moral approach of saying drinking alcohol is not moral. And then there was the Anti-Saloon League, which was saying we should not drink alcohol because it is promoting a culture of neglect and abuse in our society. here's a picture of the women's Christian temperance movement. You can see how they started their political protests with this funny sign. And here is a poster from the Anti-Saloon League. So Anti-Saloon League were the big advocates of prohibition. Christian temperance was more like using alcohol is a sin that we have to change within ourselves. And Anti-Saloon League was like, we need to stop people from using, buying, trading alcohol so that it is not abused, so there's no external motivation. The Anti-Saloon League argued that, and the women's temperance movement, that alcohol led to child abuse, neglect, and economic inequality. Another argument that they made was that it was a big waste of money. Big waste of money for the individual household and for the country. And during this time when Prohibition was passed, we were just entering World War I. So in this Anti-Saloon League propaganda poster, you can see how the soldiers asking, will you back me or back booze? Suggesting that our money needed to go to the war effort because, you know, the way that taxes worked back then, we didn't have the budget that we do now for our military. So people were saving their supplies and every penny that they had and trying to give as much as they could to the war at that time. Now, pivoting to another area of progressive movement, there are the muckrakers. The muckrakers were journalists. They were journalists that raked, like a rake, that you rake leaves. They raked up the muck of society, of industrialization. They exposed the bad parts of industrialization so that the American people could be informed and make decisions and laws that supported progress. As you can see here, this is a president. You see the White House in the back. Okay, with that hat, you know it's Teddy Roosevelt because he was a Rough Rider. That's just like one of his symbols. He has his mustache. He's raking up the muck of the meat scandal, which is an exposure of the meat industry, which was really uncleanly before some investigative journalism. The investigative journalism that exposed the meat industry and how nasty it was The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, who was a progressive. This was an essential novel in creating a law that would ensure that our meat was packed in a clean way. There were things like he went undercover and saw like a man fall into the meat and then it be served, people's body parts in the meat. You can see here, no gloves, no protective gear. The meat packing industry exposed humans and the meat alike to germs, and it was a danger to the American people. So when Americans read The Jungle, it inspired change, and this was a really notable accomplishment of the progressive movement. And ultimately, it created a law that our president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, passed, called the Pure Food and Drug Act. And as you can probably tell from the name, it established rules that required meat to be inspected and these factories to have certain regulations to make sure that what was being fed to the American public was safe. All right, on to the next progressive movement, the women's movement. From 1819 to 1920, women's movement accomplished the big success of women's suffrage, which was limited to white women in the South, but at least laid the foundations for universal women's suffrage later on. So when I say suffrage, I mean voting rights. Suffrage means the right to vote. Okay, so the group that formed during this time period was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and their founders were Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They wanted the women's right to vote. When they tried to discuss, what was the best way about going that, for that, they're criticized for being racist and excluding Black women in their fight. But these are the people to remember. Here you go with another picture of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Gotta just remember that name and those people: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were the people who led the movement for women's suffrage. A third major figure in women's suffrage was Alice Paul. She's maybe less remembered in the mainstream history, but is definitely someone that you should know. And fun fact, she is an alma mater of Miss Denney's college that I went to, Swarthmore College. So she was a big suffragette, is how you can describe a woman who fought for suffrage. Here is a picture of her. She participated in political protests for women's suffrage. She handcuffed herself to the White House, and then she was thrown in jail, and she did a hunger strike until women got the vote, and they were force-feeding her like tube down her throat, and she did not give up until women got the vote. With all of the efforts of the suffragettes in the national women's suffrage movement came the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So women gained the right to vote. However, in the South, Black women still could not vote until the 1960s with efforts of the civil rights movement of that time. But this was at least, once again, the foundation for what would come to full suffrage later in history. Last but not least, economic inequality and workers' rights were major focuses of progressive movements during this time period. There were the Industrial Workers of the World, founded in Chicago in 1905. This was a union that tried to oppose capitalism and promote socialism. The leader of the union was William Big Bill Haywood. He organized lumber workers, migrant farmers, miners, and textile workers to overthrow the capitalist system. Here is an International Workers of the World propaganda poster. Another major event of this time period concerning labor unions and workers was the United Mine Workers Strike of 1902, when 150,000 workers struck for higher wages in recognition of their union. This strike was important because it was the first time the federal government under President Theodore Roosevelt intervened in a strike to protect the interests of workers instead of the corporation. Here's a picture of that strike. It's kind of blurry, but you can see how many people striked, as in refused to work, in order to demand for higher wages in recognition of their union. So some corporations or businesses did not want unions because they advocate for the workers' needs, and it's easier to control your workers if they're not all together. Because of efforts by unions, eventually the federal government established an 8-hour workday law with additional pay for overtime work for interstate railroad workers. In order to address income inequality, the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed to clarify and extend an earlier act that limited the power of monopolies. It created regulations such as not allowing companies to sell goods below cost to drive competitors out of business. Another measure that drove change was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which you read about. It was that horrific fire where a bunch of textile working women were trapped because of poor regulations and poor working conditions, lost their lives to their job when it was something that could have been prevented with some oversight. Child labor was also a huge problem at the start of industrialization, since it was easy to exploit children for their work, not pay them too much money. And because this was seen as unjust by progressives, this was a federal law that ensured that child labor could not be used in the United States. So once again, just to cover the two main points that we covered today in part one, the United States continued its transition from agricultural economy to industrial economy. I talked about the T-model Ford and the assembly line. I would suggest that you do some more research into this first point. And I will also give you some reading this week to look at how industrialization rapidly increased with technological innovations and how that affected urban areas, specifically the development of cities and all across the United States. You can see how cities would develop based on their proximity to railroads. So that's something to think about as you're also exploring that first point. Which brings us to our next point. With rapid industrialization, and for the first time this was ever happening in the history of the world, there were all these problems that people were dealing with for the first time. And progressives quickly met these problems and organized people and other groups of people like women, African Americans, and all of their interest groups were able to feed off the organization of each other and get some laws passed at this time that supported the American people through this time of extreme change. All right, thank you guys. And something from this. I hope it wasn't too choppy, but I just wanted to give you a different way of taking in the information instead of just reading. And hope you're all doing well. I miss you guys. Stay safe, stay clean.